Once upon a time, deep in a lush, green forest, there lived a rabbit named Tiny. Tiny was no ordinary rabbit. He was known throughout the forest for his sharp wit and clever ideas. All the animals admired him because, no matter the situation, Tiny always managed to find a solution that was both smart and kind. One bright morning, as the forest came alive with the sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves, a cunning fox named Fong began to plot. Fong was known for his slyness and his endless appetite. That day, he was especially hungry and decided that he would have Tiny for dinner. Fong had been watching Tiny for days, studying his routines, and finally decided that today was the day he would catch him. He sneaked through the forest, his paws making barely a sound on the soft earth, until he reached the area near Tiny's burrow. From behind a thick bush, Fong watched as Tiny hopped around, nibbling on some fresh clover. With a sly grin, Fong approached Tiny, trying to seem friendly. "Hello there, Tiny," Fong called out, his voice smooth and sweet like honey. "It's been so long since we last talked. I was just thinking we should have a meal together today. What do you say?" But Tiny wasn't fooled by Fong's friendly act. He knew the fox's reputation all too well. Tiny's sharp mind quickly began to work, and he came up with a plan to outsmart Fong. He smiled at the fox and said, "Why, hello, Fong. How nice of you to visit. I would love to have a meal with you, but I have a very important task to complete today. You see, the lion, the king of the forest, has given me a special mission. He wants me to find the most delicious meal in the entire forest. If I succeed, he will declare me the smartest animal in the whole forest." Fong's ears perked up at the mention of the lion. He knew that gaining the lion's favor could be very beneficial. Plus, if there was a delicious meal to be found, Fong wanted it for himself. "The smartest animal, you say?" Fong repeated, trying to hide his excitement. "Well, that sounds like a task for someone as smart and strong as me. Why don't I help you? Together, we'll find this meal and share the glory." Tiny pretended to think for a moment, then nodded. "That's a great idea, Fong. But I must warn you, this meal is hidden in a secret place, deep within the forest. Only the bravest and fastest animals can reach it." Fong puffed out his chest, eager to prove his bravery. "Lead the way, Tiny. Nothing scares me." With that, Tiny led Fong deeper and deeper into the forest. They walked for what seemed like hours, passing through thick underbrush, crossing streams, and climbing steep hills. The forest grew denser and darker as they went, with shadows stretching long on the ground and the sounds of nocturnal creatures beginning to stir. Finally, they reached the farthest corner of the forest, where the trees were tall and ancient, their branches intertwining like a canopy over the forest floor. In the middle of a small clearing stood a large, moss-covered rock. "This is it," Tiny said, pointing to the rock. "The meal is hidden underneath this rock. But it's not just any rock, this is a magical rock. Only someone very strong can lift it." Fong looked at the rock, which was much larger and heavier than he had expected. But he was too proud to admit he might not be able to lift it. "Step aside, Tiny," Fong said confidently. "I'll have this rock moved in no time." Fong dug his paws into the ground and began to push against the rock with all his might. He grunted and strained, his muscles bulging as he tried to move the massive stone. But no matter how hard he pushed, the rock wouldn't budge. Fong's paws slipped on the moss, and he stumbled, his fur becoming matted with dirt and sweat. As Fong continued to struggle with the rock, Tiny quietly took a few steps back, watching with a twinkle in his eye. He had known from the start that Fong wouldn't be able to move the rock, but he wanted to give the fox a lesson in humility. After several more minutes of fruitless effort, Fong finally stopped, panting heavily. He looked around, realizing that Tiny had slipped away while he was distracted. "Tiny?" Fong called out, but there was no answer. He was all alone in the darkening forest. It was then that Fong understood he had been tricked by Tiny, the clever rabbit. Exhausted and humiliated, Fong sat down on the cold ground. He knew he couldn't go back to the forest's heart and face the other animals after being outsmarted by a rabbit. With his tail between his legs, Fong slowly made his way back to his den, hungry and defeated. Meanwhile, Tiny was already back in his cozy burrow, safe and sound. He chuckled to himself, thinking about how easily Fong had fallen for his trick. Tiny knew that cunning and greed often led to trouble, while wit and kindness always won in the end. The next day, word of Tiny's clever escape spread throughout the forest. The animals marveled at Tiny's intelligence, and even the lion himself heard of the rabbit's feat from that day on. Tiny was not only respected but also celebrated as the wisest creature in the entire forest. And so, Tiny continued to live in peace, knowing that with a little wit and a lot of heart, even the smallest among us can outsmart the mightiest foes. The end. Subscribe to my channel for more videos like this.